Kofi stood at the edge of his farm, looking at the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. He felt the weight of his recent decision still heavy on his heart. Turning down the money from the businessman had been difficult, but it was the right choice. The farm was his life, his identity, and the future of the village. But Kofi knew that his troubles were far from over. A few days later, Kofi heard whispers in the village. The wealthy businessman, angry at being rejected, was planning something new. He had bought the land surrounding Kofi's farm and was planning to build a giant factory. This factory would destroy the environment, pollute the rivers, and harm the crops. Kofi knew that if the factory was built, his farm and the entire village will be ruined. Kofi felt his stomach twist with fear. He had to do something, but he didn't know what. He had fought hard to protect his land before, but this time, it seemed like the businessman was unstoppable. Kofi decided to go to the village elders for advice. The elders were wise and had always helped him in the past. The elders listened carefully as Kofi explained the situation. They agreed that the factory would be a disaster for the village, but they also wanted Kofi that the businessman was powerful, had many connections. They suggested that Kofi gathers facts of the harm the factory would cause and take it to the city council. Kofi agreed and started to work immediately. He and a few villagers began collecting water samples, taking pictures of the plants and animals that will be affected, and taking to experts about the potential damage. It was hard work, but Kofi was determined. He knew that if he didn't stop the factory, everything he had worked for would be lost. Weeks passed, and Kofi gathered all the evidence he could. Finally, the day came for him to present his case to the city council. Kofi was nervous, but he knew he had to be strong. He stood before the council members, his heart pounding, and explained why the factory would be harmful. He showed them the evidence he had collected and spoke passionately about the importance of the land to his village. The council members listened intensely. Kofi could see that some of them were convinced, but others were hesitant. The businessman's lawyers argued that the factory would bring jobs and money to the area. They tried to make Kofi look like a foolish farmer who didn't understand the benefit of progress. Kofi felt a lump on his throat. He had done everything he could, but it wasn't enough. The council decided to allow the factory to be built. Kofi was devastated. He had lost. The village had lost. As he walked back home, he felt a deep sadness in his heart. How could he protect his village now? The next morning, Kofi woke up to find the village in chaos. The businessman's workers had arrived and started clearing the land. Trees were being chopped down and the sound of machines filled the air. Kofi ran to his farm, his heart racing. He had to find a way to stop this, but what could he do? As he stood there, watching the destruction, an idea came to him. It was risky, but it was the only chance he had left. Kofi ran back to the village and gathered the people. He told them his plan, and although they were scared, they agreed to help him. The night under the cover of darkness, Kofi and the villagers sung unto the land. They walked quietly and quickly. setting up traps and barriers to slow down the construction. They tied ropes between trees, dug holes in the ground, and hid tools that the workers would need. By dawn, they had done everything they could to delay the work. The next day, the workers arrived only to find that they couldn't continue. The businessman was furious. He demanded that the workers find out who was responsible. But the villagers stayed silent. No one would betray KOFI. For days, the work was delayed and the businessman grew more and more angry. KOFI knew it was the only way to stop the businessman from continuing. But he had to keep fighting. He couldn't let the factory destroy everything. One afternoon, as KOFI was walking through the village, he noticed a strange man following him. The man was dressed in dark cloth and had a hard look in his eyes. KOFI's heart started to race. He knew that this man was trouble. KOFI quickly turned down a side street and hurried to the village elder's house. KOFI told the elder about the man, and the elder frowned. "You must be careful, KOFI," the elder warned. "The businessman is desperate. He will do anything to get what he wants." That night, KOFI couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the man and what he might do. As the moon rose high in the sky, KOFI heard a noise outside his window. He peered out and saw a man from earlier standing in the shadows. KOFI's heart pounded in his chest. He had to act fast. KOFI quickly slipped out the back door and ran to the village square. He knew that he had to warn the villagers, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. KOFI ran to the house of his closest friend, Kwame, and knocked urgently on the door. Kwame opened the door, rubbing his eyes. "KOFI, what's wrong?" he asked. "There is a man following me," he whispered. "I think he's working for the businessman. We need to warn the village." Kwame nodded, and together they went from house to house, knocking the villagers and telling them about the man. By the time the sun began to rise, the whole village was on alert. They knew they had to be careful. The businessman would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. The next day, KOFI was careful to stay out of sight. He knew the man was still watching him, waiting for a chance to strike. But KOFI was determined not to give him that chance. He stayed close to the village, surrounded by his friends and family. As the days passed, KOFI noticed that the man had stopped following him. He thought maybe the danger had passed, but he knew better than to let guard down. He kept working on his farm, teaching the villagers new techniques and helping the community grow stronger. But KOFI's troubles were far from over. One evening, as the sun was setting, a group of men arrived in the village. They were dressed in suits and looked very serious. The leader of the group stepped forward and introduced himself as Mr. Mensah, a government official. "KOFI," Mr. Mensah said, "I have come to talk to you about your farm." KOFI felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that this couldn't be good news. Mr. Mensah explained that the government had decided to take over KOFI's land. They claimed it was for the greater good, that they needed the land for a new development project. KOFI couldn't believe what he was hearing. After everything he had done, after all the sacrifices he had made, They were going to take his land away. He felt his heart sink, but he knew he couldn't give up. He had to fight back. KOFI decided to gather the villagers once more. Together, they would protest against the government's decision. They would show the officials that the land was more than just soil and crops. It was their home, their future. The villagers gathered in the square, holding signs and chanting. They marched to the government's office, demanding that the officials listen to them. KOFI led the way, his heart filled with determination. He knew that this was their last chance to save the village. As they reached the office, Mr. Mensah came out to meet them. He looked surprised to see so many people. "What is this?" he asked, frowning. "This land belongs to us," KOFI said, his voice strong. "We won't let you take it away." Mr. Mensah looked around at the angry faces of the villagers. He seemed to realize that this was not going to be easy. He signed and nodded. "Let's talk," he said. KOFI and the villagers spent hours explaining their situation, showing the evidence they had collected, and pleading with the officials to reconsider. Finally, Mr. Mensah spoke. "I see that this land means a lot to you," he said. "We will hold off on the development for now, but you must understand the government has its plans." KOFI felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had won a small victory, but he knew that the fight wasn't over. The village would have to stay strong and united if they wanted to protect their home. In the weeks that followed, KOFI worked harder than ever. He knew that he had to keep improving the farm, making it as valuable as possible. The more successful the village was, the harder it would be for anyone to take it away. But just as things seemed to be settling down, a new problem arose. One morning, KOFI woke up to find his crops dying. The plants that had once been green and healthy were now withered and brown. KOFI's heart sank. He knew that something was terribly wrong. KOFI called for help, and the villagers gathered to inspect the damage. They found the strange substance in the soil and water, things that shouldn't be there. KOFI realized that someone had poisoned the land. KOFI felt a deep anger rise within him. He knew who was responsible: the businessman. He had tried to destroy the village in secret, poisoning the land so that the farm would fail. KOFI clenched his feet. He couldn't let the businessman win. KOFI decided to take matters into his own hands. He went to the city, seeking help from scientists and experts. He showed them the evidence of the poisoning and asked for their assistance in saving the land. The scientists agreed to help, and they came to the village to study the problem. Days turned into weeks, and the scientists worked tirelessly to clean the soil and water. Slowly, the land began to heal. The crops started to grow again, and the village began to recover. But KOFI knew that the battle was far from over. The businessman was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he had won what he wanted. KOFI knew he had to be ready for anything. He trained the villagers in farming techniques and taught them how to protect the land, and prepared them for any future attacks. The village grew stronger and more united, determined to protect their home at all costs. But one night, as Kofi was resting after a long day's work, he heard a knock on his door. He opened it to find a stranger standing there, a woman he had never seen before. She was dressed in simple cloth, but there was something mysterious about her. "Are you Kofi?" the woman asked, her voice soft but firm. "Yes," Kofi replied, unsure of what to expect. "I have come to warn you," she said, her eyes filled with urgency. "The businessman is planning something terrible. You must be prepared." Kofi's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The woman looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. "He's going to destroy the village. He has hired men to come and burn it to the ground. You must act quickly." Kofi felt a cold fear grip him. He had known that the businessman was ruthless, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. He thanked the woman and hurried to the village square, where he called the emergency meeting. The villagers listened in shock as Kofi told them what the woman had said. They knew they had to act fast. Kofi suggested that they set up a watch, keeping guard over the village day and night. They would prepare for the attack, but they would also try to stop it before it happened. Kofi and the villagers worked tirelessly, setting up traps and defenses around the village. They trained in secret, ready to protect their home at any cost. Days passed and the tension grew. They knew the attack could come at any moment. Finally, one night, it happened. The sound of approaching footsteps filled the air, and Kofi knew that the time had come. He signaled to the villagers and they moved into position, ready to defend their home. The attackers came, their faces hidden by masks. They tried to set fire to the village, but the villagers were ready. They fought back with all their strength, using everything they had learned. The battle was fierce, but Kofi and his people were not defeated. As the sun began to rise, the attackers retreated, unable to defeat the villagers. Kofi stood in the square, his heart pounding. As he watched the last of the attackers flee, they had won, but the cost had been high. Some of the villagers were injured. Kofi knew that they had come close to losing everything, but he also knew that they had shown the businessman that they were not to be underestimated. The village was strong and they would continue to fight for their home. As the weeks passed, the village slowly began to rebuild. The wound healed and the crops grew again. Kofi continued to work hard, knowing that there would always be challenges ahead. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. The village was united, and together they could face everything. One evening, as Kofi stood on his farm, watching the sunset, he felt a deep sense of peace. The village was safe, the land was healing, and the future looked bright. Kofi knew that there would always be those who sought to destroy what he had built. But he also knew that as long as he had the support of his village, he could overcome anything. And so, as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Kofi smiled. He had faced many challenges, but he had never given up. The village was in honor and the world protected. No matter what came next, Kofi knew that they would stand strong together. Kofi's success in protecting his farm only fueled his determination to improve his village. He knew that education had been the key to his achievements, so he decided to expand his knowledge even further. KOFI enrolled in more advanced courses, learning about new farming techniques, modern business practices, and community development. The more he learned, the more he realized how much potential his village had. With his newfound knowledge, KOFI started new businesses, each one designed to create jobs for the villagers and boost the local economy. He opened a milling factory that processed the crops grown in the village, ensuring that the farmers received fair prices for their produce. He also launched a transportation service connecting the village to nearby towns and making it easier for people to trade and travel. The villagers who had once struggled to make ends meet now had steady income and a brighter future. As KOFI businesses thrived, so did the village. KOFI used his wealth to build a modern hospital, ensuring that everyone had access to quality health care. He also established new schools where children could learn and dream of bright futures, just as he had. KOFI didn't stop there. He had set up training centers, offering courses in agriculture, technology, and entrepreneurship so that the villagers could continue to grow and prosper. The village, once small and struggling, was transformed into a bustling community. People from neighboring areas came to see the changes and learn from KOFI's success. His village became a model of development, and KOFI became known as the richest man in the sub-region. But more than that, he was respected and loved by his people for all he had done to lift them out of poverty into a new era of prosperity. In the end, KOFI's journey taught him his village an important lesson: that education, knowledge are the greatest tools for building a better future. KOFI had once walked away from school, but when he returned, he discovered that learning could empower him to achieve not just personal success, but also the transformation of his entire community. KOFI's story became an inspiration for many, a reminder that with determination, knowledge, and a strong sense of purpose, anyone can overcome challenges and create a lasting impact on the world around them.